Be right there. All right. Well, I think I was tasked with talking about Green River and prepping us for getting us out in the field. So I'm going to try to focus on that. I'll get into some of the background of what Green River actually looks like, what you can expect out there, and some of the variation of the landscape there, and how that contributes to some of the variation in the Duff and then the canopy differentiation across the whole site. And then I'll get into a little bit of the science, and I have some Miscanthus slides, but I don't have to touch on that anymore, really. So, I'm a PhD candidate at Clemson University. I work with Don Hagen. He's been mentioned a lot. Thanks to a lot of the folks in here that have been instrumental in setting up the fire surrogate study where I'm working right now. The fire surrogate study, for those of y'all that are not familiar, it was originally a national study with 12 sites all across the country, all the way from the Pacific Northwest to down California, and then from Florida up to Ohio. And we have one in the Southern Appalachians right here in North Carolina, which is where we're going today. And that is one of only four that is still left. So of the 12, that is the only one of four that is still active. Um, where it is actually located is in Polk County, which we're located somewhere around here. And so, in the grand scheme of things, it's right on the border from the mountains to the Piedmont. So you have the ecoregion change right here, and the study site is located right there. It's still in the mountains, and it still behaves like the mountains, but it does have some influences from the Piedmont as well. And going in a little closer, we are right at the edge of this map somewhere here. I don't know Henderson County that well, but we're right around here somewhere, and we're going to drive all the way right here. And so this study is located on two portions of the gorge. So you have the Green River flowing through right here, and there's portions of the study that are on the north side of the gorge, and then on the southern side of the gorge. We will go to this northern side right there. And so get you a little caught up, and I know Matt gave you some overview on this already. The study essentially was as a way to understand and figure out how fire and fire surrogate treatments were affecting the landscape when applied repeatedly over time. And so, as Max said, it involved a burn treatment, a mechanical treatment where all stems below 4 inches in diameter and all the shrubs, anything woody below 4 inches in diameter, was cut down to the ground with chainsaws and left. A combination of those two, where the mechanical treatment was done before the following prescribed fire, and then, of course, a control. And they were arranged in lots of different ways. There's actually 3 reps. This is rep 2. And so you have the control, the mechanical, the burn mechanical, and the burn only treatment that were stacked up, and they were arranged in different ways in 3 different reps. The burn and mechanical and the burn treatment were burnt in the same burn unit. Essentially the study is composed of 3 separate burn units that were aimed to being burned almost at the same day. And sometimes that was possible, but not all the time. And so the way the study was set up is with a grid pattern of points that essentially 40 points per treatment. For across the whole study, there would be 480 grid points that were permanently established that Mac witnessed being put in the ground, and Dean personally put in the ground with Helen and Greg in 2000, I believe. And so there's a lot of these points out there, and every one of these points, that's where fuel was sampled. And so every year, before each burn, and throughout many years until now, these treatment points have been sampled for fuels. For vegetation sampling, every 4th point was used for vegetation sampling. So that includes all the understory herbaceous layer, all the saplings, seedlings, and the overstory was measured in these plots. So that's where all that data comes from that Mac was presenting on. And so here's just a presentation of the 3 replicates. You got replicate 1, replicate 2, and replicate 3. We will be going to replicate 1 up there. But essentially to give you an idea of the size and scope of these, it's 25 acres for each treatment unit. for a total of about 300 acres across the whole study, all replicates. So this is all the data that was actually taken at Green River and all those plots. That's a lot. First, you have here on the left, you have the different burns. Like Mac was saying, there's been 5 burns. About an average 5-year return interval on between those. But you have vegetation that was collected, fuels, coarse woody debris, soils. Thank you, Mac. Small mammals, birds, herps. I'm not sure what that one is. That was pathways, pathogens. There we go. Thank you. Entomology, so insects, and economics of the site. And some of them have been studied, have been collected longer. Soils, fuels, and vegetation being some of the ones that were collected the longest. And so it's quite it's the longest running fire effect study in Southern Appalachians. There's nothing else that exists like this with this long-term vision. And there's lots of papers that have come out of that. Here's just a few. I think it's probably about 100, 150, maybe even 200. If you combine all of them, some of them have been like this one. This recent one combines all 3 existing studies and synthesizes them from Washington, California, Ohio to North Carolina. So there's a lot of work that's come out of it, and a lot of our fire in the Southern Appalachians that we now know is due to this study being established in the Southern Appalachians. So I want to give you a little bit of an idea of what the study site looks like and what you can expect. We're not going to Rep 2, this is Rep 2, but this kind of gives you, I think, a better overview of the range of variation on the landscape. So again, you have the different treatments right here, the control, mechanical, burn mechanical, and the burn only. But that's not really that important right now. I do want to just give you a picture of the lay of the land. It's quite variable. It's not like in the coastal plain where everything's the same. There's a lot of nooks and crannies in here, lots of ridges, lots of small little hollers. And so the vegetation changes, the way that fire behaves in those places, it changes. And that affects how the duff behaves after a fire. That's how affects how the canopy looks like. And so if I superimpose the heat load index, which is essentially an index of how much solar radiation a site gets, you get some of these western slopes, southwestern slopes, that get a lot more of the solar radiation, and some of the more northeastern slopes in blue that don't get as much solar radiation. So that represents a little bit how fire severity would work. Those southwestern slopes are going to burn a lot hotter than some of those other northeastern sites. And so quite variable out there. And so all those plots have to pick up all that different variation. And so the canopy is going to respond differently, and the duff is going to respond differently in all across the whole study site. And it was set up with that in mind. Again, if I lay over everyone familiar with the ecozone modeling by Stephen Simone? This is, I think, the 3rd approximation from 2015, if I'm right, or 2011. I forget exactly when he published that. But red is pine O'Keefe. And then you get down in the coves where it's more acidic cove, and the blue is Montano hickory, so more of a dry mesic situation. So quite variable. This is just modeled. The conditions on site may actually change and may look different, but that's a lot of variability to deal with in prescribed fire, and also seeing the effects and interpreting the effects afterwards. Canopy height map, and this is from 2017 LiDAR, where you can see that the blue areas, the blue is essentially tall canopy, so tall trees. And then the lighter areas, the yellowish, greenish areas, that's essentially no canopy. So you can see right here, there's not a whole lot of canopy in that area. And some of these places right here, there's not a whole lot. There's a couple of patches where there's not. And that's all within the burn unit. Outside the burn unit right here, there's not really a whole lot of canopy gaps. So the fire had effect on the landscape, and we see that come out in the wash and the averages. But really on the landscape, it's not just an average. It's so different. Like this site up here, even though it might be in the burn mechanical treatment, is drastically different from this site. And so when you look at the conditions out there and look at the duff on the ground, there might be a lot of duff up here, no duff right here. So it really changes. And so the averages that we see in some of these data have to be taken with that in mind because the conditions on the site are so variable. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of what the whole landscape out there looks like when we go out this afternoon. And so after 5 burns at Green River, again, about a 5-year interval, and then of course we had a wildfire, and this is before the wildfire though. Some of the forests look like this, where the mid-story and the understory have been burnt away after 5 years, creating quite an incredible woodland. You know, you have an open mid-story, some canopy gaps, facilitating some light to the forest floor where you have some of those resprouting shrubs and some herbs coming in. So that's one side of the spectrum in the prescribed fire units. The other side of the spectrum looks like this, where Matt was alluding to some of the more intense fire behavior that was experienced in some of those southwestern slopes. It looks like this, where much of the canopy was killed, and now you end up with a sea of saplings that resprout after each fire, and the fire return interval is not quite long enough for those species to escape. So now they just resprout. Yeah, there's a couple in the canopy. Most of those have a lot of scars, and they slowly fall over time with wind. So that's quite interesting to see this difference. These receive the same treatment, but they might be on different topographic, different aspects, different ecozones. So there's a lot of things that affect these sites. And so when looking at this site over time to give you an idea how this site has behaved, and I'm getting to Duff here in a moment, you're the first one to see this data. Actually, I made this last night. We were talking a lot about data until 2018, right? That was the last time overstory data was taken. For the last 2 years, I took data in 2004 and 2005, at 24 and 25. And so you can now see the trajectory past 2018. And so you have the burn mechanical treatment in the bottom, the dark green. You have basal area. Everyone understands what basal area is, right? Essentially, you cut off a tree at about breast height, and you look at it at the top, and you add all of those areas up from the top view for an acre, and that's your basal area per acre. And so the basal area per acre declined for the burn mechanical treatment. It also declined for the burn-only treatment, but only slightly, not really a whole lot. And again, these are averages. It changes across the landscape. While the control and the mechanical treatment just remained steady and increased in basal area steadily over time. And then, of course, this decline right there is the Helene, the drop in basal area because of Helene. A little bit of the wildfire, although that came out in the wash, more or less. And so as these trees fell out of the canopy, died, they became snags. And so after the first fire, a lot of trees got killed. And so they turned, especially in the burn mechanical treatment, and so those turned into snags in the burn mechanical treatment. A little bit also in the control, in the burn only treatment. And so you have trees that die because of the fire, then they transition to being snags, and they decline over time as well because snags eventually fall as well. And so, oops, that was the wrong button. And then once the snags fall, they turn into coarsewood debris, 1,000-hour fuels. So you kind of see that transition of trees dying from fire in the canopy, becoming snags, and once the snags fall, becoming coarsewood debris. So that's kind of has happened throughout the study site. Until now, still, there's lots of snags still that are falling, but not nearly as many as there are there. And then if we look at the leaf litter fluctuates with each burn. And so you might burn all the leaf litter away, and then through leaf fall, all those leaves essentially start accumulating again over time until they have reached the more or less the equilibrium from before, until the next fire happens. And so that's how you see these jagged figures in the burn and burn mechanical treatment. And here finally to Duff. The change in Duff follows all those same patterns that we've seen between the burn mechanical and burn only treatment. With the burn mechanical treatment, losing a lot of the duff. In some places it lost all the duff, but these being the averages, it lost the most duff out of all the treatments. The burn only treatment lost a lot of duff as well. A fair amount, but not quite as much as the burn mechanical treatment. The mechanical only treatment had lost some, but it's somewhat negligible with the control treatment gaining in duff. The more you have leaf litter fall, the more the duff continues to build over time. And so that's what's happening pretty much in most of our forests in the Southern Appalachians. And so I want to get back to this range of variation because that's what we're seeing out in the landscape as well, and we'll see out at the field site. You have some of these different conditions, and they're showing different results based on the range of ecozone. So you have on the right side, you have the xeric ecozone, so the drier forest, and on the left side, the more moisture forest, the mesic ecozones. And so in the places where the canopy was not killed, both of them are doing actually pretty well. Repeated fire is knocking down the mid-story, bringing light to the understory, knocking down shrubs over and over again, providing great wildlife habitat. But once you actually have killed the canopy, the xeric ecozones are doing a lot better than the mesic ecozones. In the xeric ecozones, you have a lot of pines that actually are regenerating and escaping fire because they're become fire tolerant much more quickly than all the other hardwoods. We're starting to see an actual formation of a new canopy there in those xeric ecozones. In the places where the site is a little bit more mesic on the left side, and the whole canopy was killed, oaks are now fighting with all those those light-loving species like poplars and even maples, and even though they can tolerate shade quite well, they're now fighting. Oaks are fighting with a bunch of other species, and they're not escaping fire. And so those places, the success in restoring and bringing some of those oak back to the landscape is a little bit more limited, and we'll see that out there. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. And now this is I'm trying to figure out how to best present this. But essentially, if you go back in time, fire used to come across the landscape and burn off the mid-story over and over again, promoting the oaks and getting fewer and fewer of those species actually to go into the canopy, resulting in open forest conditions where the crowns of the oaks were able to just grow and grow and grow and touch each other. You had few trees per acre, but large trees per acre. Does that make sense? Those were some of the old growth conditions in a forest. And there is a paper from Hebrig et al. That figured out what those conditions would look like on a stocking chart. And I'm going to explain this stocking chart real quick. So a stocking chart essentially is a way to look at how densely stocked a forest is. And so you have the density of the trees at the base right there, so in trees per acre. And then you have the basal area of a site on the y-axis. Density of trees and basal area. And you can plot a stand. If you measure a stand, you can plot a stand somewhere along this axis. And the further you are towards the top, the more highly stocked the stand is. As in, you can't fit, if you increase the basal area or you increase the density of trees, you can't fit any more trees on that stand. Does that make sense? And if you bring the stocking down, there's the stocking percentage on this side, you can start fitting more trees. You get more light into the forest. There is more space. So think about it as in terms of how much space is there. Up here, there's not a whole lot more space for trees to grow, while down here, there's a fair amount of space for trees to grow. And so Hebrig et al. Made the range of 70% stocking to 30% stocking as that threshold where woodlands exist, where you just have just few enough trees, but just enough that can close the canopy. So few trees, but large enough trees that can still close the canopy. And if you have any fewer trees or any smaller trees, you're gonna create more light and canopy gaps, and you're gonna create more open woodland conditions where down here you essentially get a savanna below the 30%. Does that make sense? Okay. It's kind of complicated, but I think it's a fascinating way to understand how the place at Green River has changed and how variable it is. And so when I plot all those plots at Green River on the stocking chart, it looks like this. And this is pre-treatment in 2001. And so you have all the little points that are each representing each individual plot. And then you have the large dots right there that are the averages for each treatment. And so mechanical is white, control is black, burn mechanical is yellow, and the burn only is purple. And so now I'm going to go through a couple of these. And mainly I want you to follow these mean dots right there, that are the averages, over time. You can also follow some other dots, but the other dots are there for you to understand how variable it actually is. These means might tell us a general story, but the range of variation is really what is interesting out there. There we go. That's what it looks like after 23 years of prescribed fire management. This is what it used to look like in 2001, and this is the change that occurred over 23 years. So the unburned treatments, so mechanical and the control, essentially just increased in stocking, getting denser and denser, while the burn stayed relatively steady where it was beforehand. Maybe the trees got maybe fewer trees and the trees got a little larger, while the burn mechanical treatment shifted down into that woodland threshold. And that's what it looked like in the spread. Still a large spread. Even the mechanical treatment that is down here has points all the way up here. So it's quite variable all throughout, and that is dependent on all those ecozones, etc. And then we just narrowed back down to those means, those averages across treatment. And what did Hurricane Helene do? This is 2004 data. And then I collected data last year in 2025. And so this is what happened. A bunch of trees fell, and essentially every single treatment, it was relatively similar across all treatments. It all they reduced in stocking. Makes sense, right? We would have expected some differences between treatments, but this is what it looks like. And so Duff follows these kind of variations. You have some parts where you have no Duff, and the herb layer looks incredible. There's an incredible sea of wildflowers and grasses, everything in between. And then you have places where the Duff hasn't really been eroded away a whole lot. And you have a bunch of oak and other seedlings that are coming in, but not really a whole lot of herbaceous species. And so I look at Duff from an herbaceous species perspective because I'm not really a trained soil scientist, but I'm more of a plant forest ecologist. So in places where you have no canopy, you see that? You can really establish an incredible herbaceous layer. So many different species that you don't really see besides in some power line right-of-ways and road right-of-ways. Really incredible. And this side doesn't really have any Duff. Here's another image. Lots of herbaceous species coming in. Here's another one of my favorite spots. 100% cover, or maybe even 120% cover because they overlap. So really cool. On the other end of the spectrum, it looks like this. Well, you don't really have much of a loss of trees. The Duff hasn't really reduced as much, and we'll ask Mac about why that is. Now, there's some unknowns about that, but they do seem to go hand in hand, like Mac was saying. Again, not really any herbaceous species coming in some of those places, and so the sites with more Duff consumption, where there's not as much Duff, those are the places with great herbaceous diversity. And of course, some of the sites that are dominated by ericaceous species, so those heath shrubs like mountain laurel, I have a list of them, I think, somewhere. Mountain laurel, rhododendron, blueberry, huckleberry, and featherbush, just to name a few. They're duff builders because they are mycorrhizal association. And so those sites, the duff has decreased even less. And so even when you burn right here, repeatedly, this has seen 5 burns. Herbaceous species don't really come in, even though the duff hasn't been reduced enough yet. But then there's some sites in between where you have maybe on the edge of a canopy gap, or places where fire has slowly over time eroded that duff layer just enough. You see some of those little specks of green come in right after a burn. You see that? It's somewhat hard to see. It's even hard to see when you're out in the field, but there's all these little tiny grass seedlings that are coming in from seed that are establishing in places where the duff has just worn down enough. And so it is spreading from the areas that received a lot of duff reduction early on. It's now, after 25 years, it is getting to some of the areas that are in the small canopy gaps, in the smaller places where the canopy hasn't been reduced as much. Here's another photo of that. And so great duff reduction really brings out a lot of the herbaceous species, and we'll see that out there. And in some of the places where the duff hasn't been reduced, the herbaceous diversity is not as nice. But like Mac was saying, that comes with time. And as we go out there, we'll see some of this variation on the landscape. Throw out some species that are promoted by that. Of course, milkweeds, grasses, lots of legumes and sunflowers, morning glories, lots of orchids that are actually benefiting from scrap fire and that increased light. Of course, deer and turkey and other lots of wildlife species, insects. And I'm not going to harp on miscanthus. We'll get out there. I didn't know how much time I would have. So you can see some of this site that has lots of herbaceous species and has a lot of duff reduction, has a lot of miscanthus as well. And those things come hand in hand. So I'm going to jump ahead here real quick because I do have a nice miscanthus video as well, but I'm going to jump over that. For a field trip, we're going to go to Rep 1. Looks like this. We're going to park right here. And we can design this however we want. There's lots of experts in the room. And there's lots of different interests. I'm going to propose that we do something like this. We walk over here to the control. Makes sense? We just kind of see what the conditions look like in the control. We'll walk over to a spot where we can see the control, the mechanical treatment, and the burn mechanical treatment from one place. Now, if we are up for it, we can walk through here. Now, this is one of those south-facing slopes where there's no canopy, so it might be brambly. We can find a way, we can see how it looks like out there. Otherwise, we can maybe walk up this ridge and see the variation in duff on either side, with and without canopy. And this area has a fair amount of duff and intact canopy, and from there we can then walk to another area that's more open, but has more of those ericaceous shrubs, miscanthus clump, of course. So propose this there for lunch. Think about, we can gather our thoughts once we get out there. But I do have some maps that you can, if you have a Venza on your phone, this goes to a Dropbox link. You can download 2 maps, and you can have them on your phone while we're out there if you're interested. So with that, I think I'm way over time. If we have questions, but we'll also be in the field. So, yeah.